Imagine you're driving down the highway on a trip, you're running low on gas, and you also feel like stopping. You happen to spot a gas station up ahead, so you decide to pull in, and almost as soon as you do, you are suddenly met with an incredible sight that you never in your life could have imagined seeing at a simple gas station. There is your favorite race car driver with his formula car. He's filling up with regular 95-octane gasoline. You can't believe it, can you? And of course it's obvious, it has to be a dream. You and I both know that those ultra-precision engines designed to run at 15,000 revolutions need a fuel with a chemistry and a purity, extreme purity. If you put 95-octane gasoline in it, the engine will start knocking, fill up with residue, and end up seizing after just 3 laps. Well, that is exactly what you're doing to your physical body every single time you drink a glass of water, while thinking it is only meant for simple hydration. You are slowly destroying your internal machinery, that magnificent biological engineering of yours, simply by not being fully aware of exactly how water works, once it finally crosses over your cell membrane. Today, I'm going to explain exactly why that persistent, heavy fatigue you carry around every single day, the kind that no medical test can seem to explain, or that silent, underlying inflammation you are constantly told to accept as a normal part of life, and that slow, steady deterioration you feel happening in your body and believe is simply inevitable, are actually the direct result of having your internal cellular battery completely drained. And it is crucial to understand that this isn't just about your genetics or your age, it is fundamentally about the laws of physics, and the best part is, it is entirely reversible. But before we fine-tune your Formula One, let me take you to a place where life and death are decided by the quality of a liquid. Let's go to a hospital for a moment, and imagine it's the middle of the night and you're in an emergency room. The atmosphere is tense, the monitors keep beeping, and suddenly a stretcher rushes in. On it, a patient on the verge of collapse, with dehydration so severe that his electrical system is about to shut down. And the doctor doesn't give him a glass of water. What the doctor does is connect an IV drip directly into his bloodstream. And unfortunately, this is exactly where most people tend to get it completely wrong. They think that IV fluid is just water with salt, but you and I are going to look under the hood. That IV fluid is actually a 0.9% isotonic sodium chloride solution. But the key figure isn't the 0.9%, it's the word isotonic. It means that the concentration of salts in that specific liquid remarkably matches almost exactly and perfectly the concentration of salts found in the liquid plasma of your very own human blood. It's not just any water, it's a liquid manufactured to exactly mimic what you already have inside you. And here comes the uncomfortable question that almost no one asks. Why is it that human life, even after millions of years of complex biological evolution, still remains so fundamentally dependent on a liquid with such a highly specific and unique chemical composition? Why does your plasma, that is, the water that bathes every one of your cells, need exactly that proportion of sodium, potassium, and magnesium? Where does that recipe come from? And you'll see, the answer is truly astonishing, which throughout the 20th century, most doctors preferred to ignore. The composition of your blood plasma is practically identical to that of primitive seawater, diluted in a very, very specific proportion. And what seems like a coincidence is in fact not a coincidence at all. It's evolutionary memory. And that means that every time a doctor in any hospital in the world hooks up an IV to a dying patient, what they're actually doing, almost always without realizing it, is returning to that sick person's body the ocean we've been connected to for 600 million years. That IV solution is not a modern invention. It's a chemical imitation of something much older than medicine, and it works because your body recognizes it as its own, as if it were coming home. But the first man who dared to say this out loud more than 100 years ago was treated as a madman by the scientific community of his time. Which proved he was right with a stray dog and a syringe. We'll get to that man and his dog in a little while, I promise you. But first, I need you to understand something that nature has also solved millions of years ago. That is, long before any Parisian scientist, because you'll see this one is from Paris, had the idea to pick up a syringe, and now you'll see, let's go together to the desert. And there, imagine a Bedouin preparing his caravan. In front of him is his camel, which suddenly does something that would seem like a waste of time to a tourist. The camel approaches some outcroppings of rock and starts licking them with absolute concentration. And this is not a travel anecdote. This is applied biophysics. What the camel is doing is not looking for flavor. What it's seeking is osmotic homeostasis. And scientists like Knut Schmidt-Nielsen, who is the father of desert physiology, dedicated years to understanding how these animals survive temperatures that would melt any other mammal. And what he discovered was that the secret isn't in storing water in their humps, which, by the way, is a myth, because the humps are pure fat. The secret lies in how camels manage their electrolytes. The camel knows that if it drinks pure water under that sun, its blood would become diluted, its cells would swell due to osmosis, and its osmotic pressure would plummet, leading to multi-organ failure and death. The camel licks stones to obtain sodium, potassium, and magnesium. These minerals are what maintain the membrane voltage, and without that mineral shield, water simply doesn't stay inside the cell. It becomes a kind of solvent that washes you out from the inside and shuts you down electrically. And you, on the other hand, drink very low mineral water because you've been told that's good for your kidneys. And then, however, you're surprised that at 3 in the afternoon your brain feels like a light bulb about to burn out. It's that simple, and that sophisticated. What the camel does by instinct, a French naturalist from the 19th century proved with data, and now is the time to return to that promise I made to you a moment ago. The man, the dog, and the syringe. That man was René Quinton. And what he did forever changed the way we understand what we really are. And you see, Quinton didn't arrive at his discovery through some divine inspiration. He was passionate about evolution and noticed a contradiction in Darwin's theory that no one else had wanted to see. If we come from the sea, why do our cells still need exactly, thank you, the same saline environment that existed in the primordial ocean? Quinton came to the profound realization that even though we emerged from the depths of the ancient oceans millions of years ago, our internal factory has remarkably never once altered its fundamental biological operating system. And as a result of his years of research, what he did was to formulate, thank you, the law of marine constancy, which basically states that our internal environment, that is, the fluid that bathes my cells and yours, is qualitatively identical to seawater. And to prove it, before the scientific community that labeled him as an enlightened eccentric at the end of the 19th century, specifically in the year In 1897, he conducted an experiment that would be practically impossible to do today. He took a stray dog, named it Sodium, and in a Paris hospital, he drained almost all of its blood until the animal was practically dead and without reflexes. And at that moment, before the incredulous eyes of the doctors who were present, he injected it with diluted isotonic seawater. And what do you think happened? Well, not only did Sodium not die, but within a few days he turned out to be more lively, more active, and with more energy than before the experiment. His body had recognized the seawater as its own plasma, and for his body it was as if he had come home, exactly like that emergency patient I told you about earlier. This resounding success was what led Quinton to take the leap to human beings. You see, at that time, Paris was ravaged by cholera and infantile gastroenteritis, and those diseases were killing babies and young children due to dehydration. So Quinton understood that these children weren't dying from a lack of water. He realized they were dying because their internal aquarium had run out of the minerals necessary to sustain life. So what did he do? Quinton opened some dispensaries to treat these children, which eventually became the famous marine dispensaries, because there he brought hundreds of hopeless children back to life. He didn't give them medicine. What he did was restore their original environment. And Quinton died in 1925, and here they say, by the way, that his funeral was one of the most crowded in history. The vast majority of those young children he had saved would never truly forget the memory of the person who restored to them the very lives they had almost lost. However, the established medical community completely buried his groundbreaking work along with him for almost a full century. But did the water remain there? Inside your body, waiting for someone with a microscope to dare to look at it again, and that someone finally arrived at the end of the 20th century. His name is Gerald Pollack. But before I start talking to you about Pollack, I'd rather begin with a figure you've probably never heard before, and that will likely change everything you think you know about yourself. Your body is 70% water by mass, and that you know, I'm sure. But the reality is that if we count the molecules that make up your body one by one, the result we'll get is that 99% of them are water molecules. To put it in another way, you are not simply a being of physical flesh that just happens to contain water. Rather, you are a complex structure of water that holds onto a small amount of solid matter. And here you see, pause for a second and take a look at your hands. When you look at them, the only thing you're seeing is the one. It's the 1% of what you are, because everything else, every space between cells, every edge of protein, every gap in your DNA, is bathed in the water I'm talking to you about, King. And this isn't just decoration, it's the matrix that supports you. And it's here and now where the doctor comes in. Pollack, the one I was telling you about. You see, he has spent decades researching at the University of Washington and asking a question that at best his colleagues have found to be an eccentric one. He suggests that, what if water, when it comes into direct contact with biological living surfaces, doesn't actually behave in the specific way that we generally tend to think it does? Pollack stopped settling for the three classic states of water, solid, liquid, and gas, a long time ago. He discovered what mainstream science had ignored for decades. He discovered the fourth phase of water and called it structured water or easy water, which comes from the English term exclusion zone. Yes, it's very surprising, but what does this mean for your body? Because in the end, that's what matters to you and me. Well, just imagine regular water The H2O you know from bottles, as if it were a chaotic jumble of molecules colliding with each other without any order. Well, when that liquid water comes into direct contact with a hydrophilic surface, that is to say, a water-loving surface, just like all of your biological cell membranes, and when that water also receives radiant light energy, something truly extraordinary happens. A remarkable phase change occurs within the structure of the water itself. The molecules that were loose and disordered organize themselves into hexagonal sheets. They stop being H2O and become H3O2. And why hexagonal? Well, think of a beehive. Think of a honeycomb. And it turns out it's not an arbitrary formula. It's the most efficient way to pack the maximum amount of information into the minimum space. Just as it works for bees, it works for water. And when water molecules organize themselves into that honeycomb, something happens that has some enormous consequences. That water expels the protons outward, that is, the positively charged hydrogens. And the hexagonal network is left with an excess of electrons, meaning it ends up with a negative charge. And you might ask, what does this mean? Well, it means you've just created a battery. You have an area with a negative charge, which is the structured water attached to your cell, and an area with a positive charge, which is the water with protons right next to it. And that difference in potential is the spark of life. It's the voltage that allows your proteins to move, your DNA to fold correctly, and your nerve signals to travel at the speed they need to. But there's something else that Pollack also discovered in his laboratory, and it changes everything. It turns out that this exclusion zone is not static. It grows when it receives energy, and specifically when it receives infrared light. And in his experiments, he measured that when water is illuminated with infrared, the exclusion zone expands, up to 3 or 4 times its original size. In other words, to put it simply, light acts in your body like a worker laying bricks in place. It expands the battery and increases the voltage. And that's why the sun, when you stand in front of it, makes you feel good. This isn't just romanticism, nor is it about vitamin D either. It's simply that the solar infrared is literally expanding your exclusion zone, increasing the voltage of your cells and charging the battery that keeps you alive. If you don't understand this mechanism, you're trying to fix your Formula One car by only looking at the bodywork, when the real problem is that you haven't charged the battery in years and it's getting harder and harder for that battery to start. Everything I'm telling you today isn't some cutting-edge science that just came out of a dark, almost unknown laboratory. It's a truth that a man with a Nobel Prize in his hand already shouted in our faces 60 years ago. And this man was named Albert Szent-Györgyi. And you see, he wasn't just anybody. He was the one who discovered vitamin C and also unraveled the Krebs cycle, which is basically where the foundations of how your cells produce energy are established. In other words, he's one of the founding fathers of modern biochemistry. And he was the one who also wrote the books your doctor studied as a reference during their career. But what truly makes Szent-Györgyi fascinating for us today is what he did at the end of his career. You see, he realized that classical biochemistry, that is, the one that says life is just a series of molecules randomly colliding with each other by pure chance, was too slow and clumsy an explanation for the complexity of what it means to be a living being. In other words, what they taught us in school biology class doesn't actually work. If life depended solely on molecule A bumping into molecule B in that vast cellular space, we would be so slow that we wouldn't even have time to blink. He understood that life doesn't happen at the level of molecules, but rather at the level of electrons. And he coined a term that still makes many in the medical community uncomfortable today. He coined the term submolecular biology. He said that our proteins are not inert matter, they are semiconductors. And like any semiconductor, like the silicon chip inside your mobile phone, thank you, they need a suitable environment for electrons to flow. And that environment is water, but not tap water. It's the hexagonal matrix that Pollack talked to you about, that is, the easy water inside you. And for Szent-Györgyi, water was not just the stage where life happens. For him, water was life itself, and he was not alone in this intuition. The geneticist and biophysicist Mei Wan-ho dedicated her life to showing us something that goes even further. She maintained that living beings are not just sacks of chemical reactions, but rather true liquid crystals, perfectly organized, where all the cells communicate with each other in an almost simultaneous way through biophotons, that is, tiny pulses of light that travel precisely through that structured water. Let me give you an easy example so you can understand. Just think of a flock of thousands of starlings flying together. If you remember, they all turn at the same time as if they were a single animal. And there isn't a leader bird out front shouting orders. That would take time to reach those in the back, because if that were the case, they would crash into each other. They move in unison because they share the same information at the same instant. You see, Mei Wan-ho said that you and I are like just another member of that flock. And what allows for that synchrony is the structured water that bathes each one of your cells. When that network breaks, the orchestra stops sounding in tune. The cells start to function on their own, and in the end, that's nothing more than what you experience as brain fog, as a heaviness that won't go away, or as inflammation that no test can explain. And it's not just that you're getting old. What's happening is that you're losing your signal. And if you want to see for yourself how much there is still to understand about water, Martin Chaplin, who is a professor at London's South Bank University, maintains a public database with more than 70 documented anomalies of water that conventional science cannot explain if we keep thinking of water as just simple H2O, and that's 70 anomalies. And the vast majority of these phenomena can be understood and explained. As soon as you stop thinking of water as a simple liquid, and instead start thinking of it as a dynamic, living battery. But if water truly functions as a biological battery, if it possesses the capacity to store an electrical charge and effectively generates physical movement, then we must ask ourselves a fundamental question that the mainstream medical establishment has avoided for many decades. Who? It truly circulates and pumps the blood through your entire physical system, because here the mathematical figures simply do not seem to align correctly. And to help us understand why, I have to take you for a moment to the forests of Austria. Victor Schauberger was not a desk-bound academic. He was a forest ranger who understood the language of water as very few ever came to understand it. He spent his days observing rivers, and one day he noticed something that had no apparent explanation. It turns out that trout were able to remain motionless in the middle of a violent current and could even leap up waterfalls against the flow without hardly moving their fins. Where did they get the energy if the water pressure was completely against them? And Schauberger, through observation, discovered that when water flows naturally, it does not move in a straight line. It forms vortices, longitudinal whirlpools that generate their own suction force. And this means that the trout does not fight against the river. It turns out that the trout is an expert pilot that reads those vortices and lets itself be propelled by them. In other words, it doesn't use up energy when swimming upstream. What it does is take advantage of that energy. And now that you know this, apply that same energy to your own body. It turns out that it is documented that you have approximately 100,000 kilometers of capillaries in your body. 100,000 kilometers. And some are so narrow that a red blood cell has to deform itself to pass through. If your human heart had to push blood through that entire complex network, using nothing but sheer physical pressure, the necessary force required would burst your delicate arteries within just a few short hours. Basic physics states this unambiguously. And you see Dr. Branco first, an associate professor in the Department of Anesthesiology at Albany Medical College in New York, demonstrated many years ago with clinical data what Schauberger had intuited. The heart is not the primary pump of the circulatory system. The heart is a rhythm regulator, that is, it is a control valve. It turns out that blood moves by itself. And how does it do that? Well, strange as it may seem, it's very simple. It does so thanks to the electric charge of structured water. Your blood vessels are completely lined on the inside by that specific exclusion zone I previously mentioned to you, when I told you all about the researcher Pollack's groundbreaking discoveries. And since that water has a negative charge and the center of the vessel has a positive charge, what happens is that an electric gradient is created that automatically drives the flow. This is remarkably similar to the way that the sap steadily ascends through the trunk of an 80-meter tall tree, despite the complete absence of a pumping heart in its roots. It is the highly organized water itself that is responsible for performing all of this incredible work. And what Schauberger intuited by observing a trout, Pollack proved by measuring water in the laboratory. Blood does not move because something pushes it from behind. Blood moves because the channel, that is your blood vessels, are electrically structured so that blood flows through them on its own. The heart is not the engine of the river. The heart is the director of the flow. And what is one of the most important consequences of what I just told you? Well, when your internal water loses its natural geometric structure, the blood becomes increasingly heavy and stops wanting to move naturally. When that happens, your heart begins to experience significant strain, working much harder while trying to compensate for what the system is simply not doing on its own. And here I am going to give you a key point that will probably catch you completely by surprise. What you call high blood pressure is actually not usually a problem of the pump being too strong. What it usually is, or what it is a cry for help from a system in which the water has lost its charge and no longer has the energy to flow on its own. High blood pressure is telling you that you are forcing your heart to act as a pump simply because you have stopped being a river. When you were a river, your blood flowed on its own. The structured water in your vessels had enough electric charge to propel itself through every capillary, and it did so without anything pushing it from behind. Originally, your heart only directed the flow, but when that vital water loses its natural geometry, and when it loses its essential electrical charge, the blood begins to thicken significantly. The once clear river turns into heavy mud. And we know that mud doesn't flow on its own. It has to be forcefully pushed through the vessels. And that is exactly what your heart is struggling to do when you are suffering from high blood pressure. It's not a sign that the pump is too strong. It's a sign that the river has stopped being a river. And your heart, which was never designed to be a pump, is paying the price for being one every day. Well, now that we have finally reached this specific point in our journey, you now possess the complete and comprehensive model. You understand clearly that you are essentially a biological battery of structured water. Furthermore, you know that this internal battery requires constant charge, high conductivity, and consistent flow to function properly. And did you know that when it fails, the body compensates until it can't anymore? Well, now comes the awkward question once again. Why is your battery failing? Well, you see, because without realizing it, and probably in a systematic way, you are sabotaging your biological battery every day. And you don't. Out of negligence, you do it purely out of misinformation. You see, come with me to meet the culprits. But before introducing them, remember that image I gave you at the beginning, the driver putting 95 octane gasoline into his Formula One car. And think about this. If you don't remove the sand from your engine's gears, it won't run at the pace it was designed for. It doesn't matter if you put in the best fuel in the world. You have to get rid of those residues, that sand. All right then, let's talk about the saboteurs. The first saboteur is the plastic bottle, and most people, when talking about plastic, only think about microplastics and bisphenol. And they're right to do so, because they really are endocrine disruptors that are well documented. And that alone is already enough reason to be concerned. But it turns out there's another dimension that almost nobody talks to you about, and I call this dimension geometric sabotage. You see, according to the work of Dr. Pollack from the University of Washington, whom I've mentioned to you, the water inside your cells, as I was saying, is not exactly H2O. It forms that fourth phase, an exclusion zone that he calls H3O2, and in order for that water to remain structured, it needs to absorb energy from the infrared spectrum. Well, it's true that this is a theory that is not yet part of the scientific consensus, but the reality is that it is changing the way we look at biological water. So, if Gerald Pollack's groundbreaking theories are correct, and I truly believe he's on the right track, it remarkably turns out that the polyethylene terephthalate plastic commonly used in water bottles would be acting as a specialized optical filter that specifically blocks these exact frequencies. In other words, you would essentially be trapping the water in a cell of complete and total electromagnetic energy isolation. Without that light, molecular order would be lost, and so would water. It would become a chaotic mess again. Well, when you drink from a plastic bottle, what you are drinking is water that has been stagnant, without movement and without light. It is water that has most likely lost its shape. In other words, you're drinking an energy liability disguised as an asset. Second saboteur, chlorine and fluoride from the tap. And here we are on perhaps firmer ground. Chlorine is added to water to disinfect it, and the truth is that it does its job very well by killing pathogens. The problem here arises because it is a powerful oxidant, and it turns out that when you ingest it continuously, that same oxidizing power also acts inside you. Obviously, it's not going to kill you in one gulp, but its daily presence adds up to wear and tear on your body. And in the case of fluoride, things are a bit more controversial. And in countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, or Germany, water is not fluoridated because they believe that the dental benefits do not outweigh the risk of systemic exposure. And here, you'll see, the conclusion is that you decide. Which side do you want to be on? And there's a third detail. Tap water is so heavily treated that it arrives almost completely devoid of living minerals. It's technically drinkable water, yes it is, but biologically flat. It simply does not provide your body with much in the way of essential nutrients. And according to several different scientific schools of thought, including those that specifically study water mineralization and its vital role in the complex processes of cellular conductivity, water that is far too demineralized tends to actively seek a state of balance within you. And what that could potentially do over time is gradually leach and carry away some of your body's own vital mineral reserves. In a few words, I could tell you that I'm talking about a fuel that comes with a built-in solvent. Apocalyptic? No. But is it ideal for a biological battery? Not really. Third, saboteur, artificial light. And here, science is very clear. Blue light from screens and LEDs disrupts your circadian rhythm, and suppresses melatonin. Plus, this affects the quality of your sleep, and no one disputes this anymore. I'm sure you know this perfectly well, but as always, there's a deeper layer. In nature, blue light never comes alone. It is always accompanied by infrared light, which is that invisible part of the solar spectrum that penetrates tissues. Your body evolved expecting the complete package. Blue light plus infrared, and both always together. Very well, the biochemist Mei-Wan Ho, whom I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, in order to describe how light organizes living matter, even spoke of quantum coherence in biological systems. And this is an idea that is still under discussion, but it is undoubtedly fascinating. But you see, there's no need to get into quantum physics to understand the intuition behind it. Do you actually avoid the sun, which is your charger? Original, free, and with infrared included, just because someone selling creams told you it was dangerous. And you spend 16 hours under a light that only has the stress of blue without the balm of infrared. In other words, you're trying to charge your battery with a cable that only emits noise. Do you think there's a better sabotage than that? The fourth major saboteur, spending too much time living indoors and a complete lack of connection from the earth. Your body evolved outdoors over millions of years. We were in constant contact with the ground, with the cycles of light, with cold and heat in a natural way. And now it turns out we've spent decades inside boxes, on rubber soles, with a climate-controlled temperature of 22 degrees all year round. But your biology was designed with the earth as an electrical reference, and for millions of years your body discharged excess positive charge on grass, sand, or moist soil. And now you spend your entire life wearing shoes with rubber soles. You constantly tread upon synthetic floors, and you live inside those artificially climate-controlled boxes I mentioned earlier. It's possible you've gone decades without connecting to the earth. When was the last time you walked barefoot on the earth? And an electrical system without grounding accumulates interference until it starts to fail. Without that contact, without those cycles, without that friction with reality, your regulatory system basically works without a natural calibrator. It's like having an instrument that you never tune. The fifth saboteur we must consider is chronic low-intensity stress, and this is the most devastating of all. And it is, because it is backed by decades of medical literature. And here you see, I'm not talking about acute stress, which is functional stress and in a way necessary. I'm talking about sustained stress, that is, the dictatorship of permanent cortisol at all hours. And you'll see what happens when you live in this survival mode. Your sympathetic nervous system keeps your cells in a state of alert. And in that specific high-stress situation, what the human body basically does is prioritize an immediate fight-or-flight response and completely halt all long-term maintenance processes, such as cellular repair, complex digestion, and tissue regeneration. All of that vital work simply gets put on hold for the time being. A body that is essentially at war with its environment has absolutely no time to build or sustain anything new. High fidelity, and here is the conclusion to the proposal I made to you at the beginning. I don't know if you remember. I promised to explain the fatigue, the inflammation, and the deterioration you feel. Here is the answer. Fatigue is a drained battery. Inflammation is a system short-circuiting due to a lack of internal order. And the deterioration that you think is uninhabitable, for the most part, turns out to be a loss of coherence. And that coherence, now that you know about it, is your responsibility. This is not just genetics, nor is it simply a matter of age. This is physics, and there is room for reversibility. With this information, I can now give you the manual. But before that, let's go back for a moment to that pilot we talked about at the beginning, the one at the gas station putting 95 octane fuel into his Formula One car. Well then, if you were his chief mechanic, what would you tell him to change first? The fuel? The tires? Or the aerodynamics? I imagine none of the three. The first thing you would tell him is to turn off the engine and to stop burning what's left of the fuel so that before adding anything, you avoid causing damage. Well, what I'm about to give you now isn't just 5 random tips. It's a pyramid. Each level supports the next, and if you skip the base, the top will wobble. Because here it's about building in order. All right, so let's get to it. Level 1, the internal state. Turn off the engine at war because that's the root cause of everything. A body in a state of constant alert under the boot of cortisol and adrenaline keeps its cells in a state of constant tension. It's spending resources just to stay alert. And that's what conventional medicine says, and it says it without any nuance. Chronic stress actively blocks essential cellular repair processes, severely impairs the quality of your nightly sleep, causes harmful oxidation throughout your bodily tissues, and ultimately accelerates the overall aging process of your entire system. Nothing you do at the higher levels will truly work if you don't resolve this first. And here is the concrete action. It is not simply about practicing some kind of mystical meditation, because what we are discussing here is actually pure fundamental physiology. What you truly need is to set aside 10 full minutes for deep, rhythmic breathing, taking a quiet and silent walk completely without your phone, and making a very deliberate, conscious contact with the natural world around you, with no other specific goal in mind than to simply relax and let go. And if you consistently do this, you will be clearly telling your entire nervous system that the long war is finally over. And only when your body is in that state of calm will it devote energy to building instead of defending itself. Level 2. Sunlight, that is, the wireless charger. Once your system is calm, you need to recharge it. And here you have the oldest, most free, and also most underused charger on the planet, the sun. The science on this is clear and fully established. Sunlight regulates your circadian rhythm, activates vitamin D production, improves your mood, and according to recent research on photobiomodulation, the sun's near-infrared light directly stimulates your mitochondrial function. Therefore, none of this is esotericism, it's measurable biochemistry, and it's also free. 15 minutes at sunrise or sunset when infrared is at its peak and ultraviolet is still low. Of course, if you live at a latitude where sunlight is scarce or your winter lasts for months, or if you work at night or simply can't go outside today, don't use that as an excuse. Do not recharge your battery because that's just one variable you can solve. And the most effective solution available is to utilize a specific 850 nanometer wavelength infrared lamp, because that very specific frequency is the exact one that deeply penetrates into the body's biological tissues and actively stimulates and enhances mitochondrial function. And it is precisely the same one that the sun would naturally provide for you during the early moments of sunrise. Look at that. It's not a perfect substitute for the sun because the sun has a full spectrum and also synchronizes your biological clock in a way that no lamp can fully replicate. But it's the best alternative available when the sun isn't around. 20 minutes at about 30 centimeters from the lamp without glasses. During the session, because seeing infrared at that intensity, which is, let's say, a domestic level, won't damage your retina. But let me tell you something. If you have any doubts, consult your doctor before making a decision. And if you have the option to choose between the sun and the lamp, always, without a doubt, choose the sun. The lamp is plan B, a very good plan B, but still plan B. And now, having explained this, I'm also going to share with you the more speculative layer, but one that is coherent, which is why I'm bringing it to you. If Gerald Pollack's hypothesis is indeed correct, that very same infrared radiation is exactly what your internal cellular water absolutely requires in order to remain properly structured. And meanwhile, others are paying for supplements to get effects that the sun gives you for free. Level 3. Grounding, that is earthing. Your body, as you already know, is an electrical system, and like any precision machine, it benefits from being grounded. You see, the simple reality is that we live almost entirely isolated, as I was saying, by thick rubber soles and synthetic floors. And so we go about our busy days constantly accumulating a significant static charge that our ancient ancestors simply never had to deal with in their lives. And nowadays there is a line of research, which is still in its early stages, on earthing or grounding, which proposes the idea that direct contact with the earth allows for an exchange of electrons with measurable anti-inflammatory effects. The existing studies are small, and broader studies are still needed to confirm them. But the reality is that the current results point in a direction that is consistent with everything I am telling you and presenting to you. So here the question is, what is the action to take in this case? Well, look, 10 minutes a day walking barefoot on grass, sand, or damp earth. And if you can't because you live in an apartment on a 10th floor, or because the weather doesn't allow it, or because it's winter and there's half a meter of snow outside your house, there is an alternative that is worth knowing about. Grounding mats or grounding sheets are conductive surfaces that connect to the ground outlet of a regular socket. But you'll see, here's something important to clarify. Not to the electrical current, because that would be dangerous, and that's not what these mats do. They connect to the ground, meaning that third prong of the outlet, which in your electrical installation is literally connected to the earth. And what they do is replicate the same exchange of electrons that happens when you step barefoot on the ground. But you'll be able to do it from your living room, from your office, or in your bed while you sleep if what you have is a grounding sheet. And here I'll give you the same warning I gave you about the lamp. They are not a perfect substitute. Natural earth has an incredible amount of variability. It contains complex microbial life, and it possesses a natural magnetic field. However, the grounding mat manages to do one specific thing very well, and that is providing electrical conductivity. For every other factor, without any doubt at all, real ground is still the superior original. But if your only alternative is to not do any grounding or to do it on a mat, then you should not hesitate to use the mat. Do it, even if it's with the mat. And with this, you'll see, I'm not asking you to have faith. I'm asking you to try it for 3 weeks and to observe how you feel, because your biology will respond, even though laboratories are still trying to put a name to what I'm telling you. You see, this is equivalent to what a camel does before crossing the desert, but in an electrical version. And now we reach level 4, living foods that are precision fuel. And here you'll see. I invite you to stop thinking of water as just something that comes out of a tap. You see, the very richest and most hydrating water you can possibly consume doesn't simply come in a plastic bottle. It actually comes from deep inside living plants. When you eat a piece of fresh fruit or a crisp raw vegetable, you're ingesting pure water that the plant has already carefully processed, having filtered it through its own cellular membranes. It has essentially osmotically organized this water, and then loaded it with a complex variety of essential minerals, vital vitamins, and active enzymes that your body needs. Therefore, it's water that comes with companions. It's not just plain water. And according to Pollack's research, it's water that already comes in that fourth phase, that is H3O2, and it's ready to be integrated into your system without your body having to spend energy to organize it. In short, it's high-fidelity fuel that's almost free. And here, let me give you some examples so you can understand. A cucumber isn't just a boring vegetable. It's an encapsulated biological filter. dark leafy greens like spinach, kale, and arugula. These vibrant greens are densely loaded with chlorophyll, which is the essential molecule that captures sunlight inside the plant. This actually means that when you eat them raw, in a very real way, you're consuming transformed light. And in the exact same way, fresh sprouts are also life at its absolute peak of metabolic activity and nutritional power. Enzymes, antioxidants, and concentrated vitality. And look, understand me well. I'm not telling you that you have to become a raw vegan. Just add them in. Try to make sure that in every meal you have, there's simply something raw, something green, or something alive. Because every time you choose this over something processed or a bottle of dead water, what you're doing is saving your body the work of having to build the structure itself. By doing this, you're giving your body the full benefit of work that has already been completed. And you allow your Formula One engine to utilize its vital internal energy reserves to perform at its peak, to think clearly, and to fully regenerate itself, instead of having to constantly process heavy and inefficient low-quality fuel sources. And finally, we reach level 5, intelligent mineralization. This is the final tuning. Only when you have everything else in the pyramid in place can minerals work their magic. And here we enter solid ground. Distilled water without salts is physically a poor conductor. Your body works with electrical currents, meaning it needs connectivity. And those currents need electrolytes. Water without electrolytes is not conductive. It lacks connectivity. So what should you do in this case? Well, add a pinch of Celtic salt or unprocessed virgin salt to your daily water. Or explore the legacy of René Quinton, that French biologist who, at the beginning of the 20th century, demonstrated that diluted in an isotonic proportion, that is, 1 part clean seawater to 3 parts fresh water, it restored internal homeostasis in critically ill patients who were dying. And even though this doesn't appear in conventional textbooks, his work is still used today in clinics all over the world. Remember the beginning of this video in the hospital emergency room. And you, if you do this, what you'll be doing is giving your system the dielectric it needs to maintain the charge, the correct conductivity, so that the current in your body flows. And your camel knew all this long before any laboratory measured it. Well then, before wrapping up, I owe you a reflection that goes beyond physics and biology. Because you see, if you think this video is about having more energy to work harder or to run 1 more kilometer on Sunday, then we haven't gotten to the heart of the matter. Because you see, this is about biological dignity. A body with dignity is an organism that regulates itself, that doesn't live in a state of emergency, and that doesn't need constant external stimuli to stay upright. Biological dignity means reaching 80 or 90 years old with a clear mind, with the ability to make decisions, to remember, and to move without depending on anyone. This is true longevity. It means not becoming a burden, neither to yourself nor to others, and certainly to no one but yourself. The pilot at the beginning didn't have an engine problem, he had a knowledge problem. He didn't know what he had in his hands. Well, from this moment on, you do know. You know that you are not a chemical machine rusting away with the passage of time. You are not. You are a living system that is refined by light, by water, and by order. Aging is not just the passing of years. To a large extent, it is the loss of coherence in your internal water. And from this moment on, that coherence is your responsibility. Start this very afternoon. Step outside into the fresh air. Remove your shoes and socks to feel the ground. Actively seek out the warmth of the sun. And drink your very first glass of water with a small pinch of high-quality, unrefined real sea salt. Not that processed white table salt they usually sell you at the local supermarket. In the coming weeks, I'm going to upload new content that will go deeper into all of this and give you even more concrete tools. If you want me to let you know when it's out, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We'll see each other soon. Your Formula One is waiting for you to take the wheel again. Go ahead, always forward, and I'll read your comments.